A digital identity is fundamental to how we confidently interact with digital services and how we express our credentials to others. It's also the sum of our digital footprint, including our healthcare records, our employment history, and our social media posts. Digital identity will certainly be one of the key building blocks for the Web3 world. Welcome to W3B Talks, an ongoing exploration of the impact of Web3 and blockchain technologies on business, government, and society. I am your host, Doug Heintzman. I'm the Chief Catalyst at the Blockchain Research Institute. And in this episode, we're going to try to answer the basic questions about what digital identity is all about and how it's going to impact the Web3 and blockchain world. To help us with this discussion, I am joined by Phil Windley. Phil is a senior software engineer at Amazon Web Services. He's the chair of the Personal Privacy Oversight Commission for the state of Utah and an adjunct professor and enterprise architect at Brigham Young University. He has a new book coming out in 2023 called Learning Digital Identity, and he is the author of the Blockchain Research Institute's research paper, Self-Sovereign Identity, the Architecture of Personal Autonomy and Generativity on the Internet, which of course is available in the research library at blockchainresearchinstitute.org. Welcome to the podcast, Phil.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, a lot of us have heard about digital identity, and a lot of us have kind of heard that we seem to be on the cusp of a technology change that's going to change the way that we think about identity. So, as we get into this conversation, I thought right off the top, it would be a good idea to kind of just do some definitional stuff. So when we talk about identity, what do we really mean?
Yeah, so obviously, identity means many different things depending on the context. But in the context of digital identity, I like Joe Andrews' functional definition the best, which is that digital identity is how we recognize, remember, and respond to people, places, things, organizations, in general, entities, right? So you think about just going down to the store. You recognize, maybe not the person by name, but you recognize, oh, there's the cashier, right? And you remember cashiers and how you interact with them. You might remember a specific one if you go to the store all the time. And you use that information to have an interaction of some kind, right? Or it could be almost anything. But recognizing, remembering, and responding to are the ways I like to think of why we build digital identity systems.
So, a lot of us are very familiar with the concept of an ID, right? That whenever we log into some sort of system, to our banking records, to our, travel arrangements, to whatever, we put in our email address or some sort of ID, and then there's a challenge, or we've got some sort of digital key, or maybe we have a two-factor authentication. So there's digital identity that is about the identity challenge of how when we interact with digital systems. That, there's a credential verification process, right? So that's kind of one form of digital identity. Mm-hmm. And, we're always figuring out better and more secure ways of doing that, and that protects us against hacking and the like. But the digital identity that you're talking about is kind of what you might call an extended identity, right? This is beyond that simple sign-on verification, right?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the sign-on verification, right? When you sign on to Amazon or Google or, your local grocer, whatever website you're going to, you're doing that so that they can recognize, remember, and respond to you, right? So it clearly fits that same definition. But the point you're getting at is it's kind of one way, right? They have a means of recognizing, remembering, and responding to you. You don't really have anything like that. One way to think about it is there are two competing philosophies around identity. And I'm not talking about digital identity. I mean, I really mean like philosophy. We're talking about Descartes and David Hume and, old time philosophers. And the one philosophy is called bundle of sticks, meaning that our identity is nothing more than a bundle of sticks. We're just the attributes that others can see and know about us, right? And in this philosophy, we're essentially nothing more than what attributes other people have put to us, or that we have been assigned in some way. The other philosophy is called substance theory, and it claims that no, there has to be something underneath all of those attributes that ties them together. Right. One of the most famous proponents of that theory is Descartes, who famously said, "I think, therefore I am." Right. That was a very succinct view of what they called substance theory, and Descartes didn't say, "I have a birth certificate, therefore I am." Right. That's not how we think of identity when we're thinking about us as people. But in the digital world, right, it's been pretty much reduced to just how does a website, how do I log in, and how do they know it's me each time? And, do they remember my credit card information or some other attributes that they need, right? So it really has been just this kind of bundle theory collection of attributes.
Okay, so let's talk about that. So there's attributes is, of course, a very fundamental part of a digital identity, right? Things like your name, your address, your age, your citizenship, maybe your healthcare records, your buying patterns. These are all attributes of you, right? Then but beyond that, there's also claims that I'm making. And I suppose some credentials can be part of the claim. I claim that I have degrees from these universities, or I claim that I'm Doug. I claim that I'm both a Canadian and American citizen, and I've got certain voting rights, and I claim that I'm over 21 so that I can go into bars, right? So there's the whole kind of issue about claims. And then there's credentials that back up those claims, right? A diploma from a university or a passport or a driver's license. And then you've got third-party attestation, right? Which is that the university says, yes, this is Doug, and he does have these credentials, right? Or I am the government, and I say he's over 21, right? So these are all, I'm assuming that these are all various different, beyond the core attributes. These are some of the aspects of digital identity that start to come into play in this new world. Yeah.
And I like to say that we don't build digital identity systems to manage identities. We build digital identity systems to manage relationships. Right? The reason we have digital identity systems is to create a relationship of some sort. Now, many of the relationships we have online with, especially on the web, are transactional. But a lot of relationships we care about are interactional, and we use messaging apps and email and other things in order to maintain those relationships. But there are identity aspects in all of that underlie that, right? That without that, I mean, the one of the big problems of the online world is what I call the proximity problem, right? You're not close to the people you're interacting with. And so you can't use the traditional means we have in the physical world of recognizing and remembering people. So you have to be able to do that at a distance. And so digital identity is one way we do that. And like I said, I think we do that primarily because we want some kind of digital relationship.
So you just touched upon a topic that's really been top of mind for me for quite a while now. And it relates to this concept of an extended identity, because, as you point out, it's not just the attributes, but it's things that allow us to establish relationship. And some of those things can be content that we write, right? We write an article for a newspaper and we put our name on it, and people have a relationship with that information and with the reputation that I, as an author of that, kind of impart. And of course, in the digital world, especially in the Web2 world, the social computing world, everyone becomes a content provider and everyone's an author and everyone's got an opinion. And we find ourselves in a world where, first of all, it's not necessarily true that all opinions are created equal, just because the authors have different degrees of expertise or may have different agendas or points of views that need to provide context to whatever content they provide. And second of all, and this is kind of the alarming problem, is that we find ourselves in a world where there are people that are trying to manipulate other people and public opinion by representing themselves in a certain way and putting out, content upon a false reputation that they're hoping people will consume and thus, impact public opinion on any particular topic, right, of politics or economics or sports or whatever. But so in this new world, as you kind of think about this expanded view of digital identity, how do we tackle that part of the problem, right? I mean, understanding that people are who they say they are, and we understand the context for content.
Yeah. So, there's the famous New Yorker cartoon from, I don't know, the 90s, that on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. And, that's funny, but it's also true, right? I mean, they also don't know whether or not you are a sports writer who knows anything or, whatever, right? I mean, everybody, like you say, everybody has an opinion and kind of an equal voice. And there are good parts of that. And of course, there are some parts of that we've all discovered maybe aren't so good. And, I don't know that digital identity all by itself can solve that problem, but it's certainly foundational to whatever solution we might want to put in place, right? So, and what I mean by that is, everybody can claim to be whatever they want, but digital identity has the means of helping us know whether or not those claims are true, right? Who do we put our trust in and why do we trust that? There's no single answer to that question, right? Like you mentioned, when you want to prove something about your degrees from a university, that's one way we do it. And there are whole structures built up, accrediting agencies and things like U.S. News and World Report ranking that we use as input to deciding whether or not we value the credentials you put forth in terms of your education. You've got a driver's license, maybe you've got a national ID card, you've got, your loyalty card from the local supermarket. Now, nobody probably cares that you're a loyal shopper at Dave's Foods, but they might care that you have a certain degree or that you worked at a certain place for a certain kind of certain amount of time. And so identity allows us to prove those things inside a relationship, whether or not the people in that relationship value them or, how much they want to trust them is a different question that identity can't say anything about. So
I'd like to believe that in this this Web3 world that, we have various different cryptographic proofs and we've got immutable records and ideally that there are national governments that have, digital identity programs that provide kind of a core anchor that we can then attach a whole bunch of other, identity attributes to that, whether it's because I've got the certifiable credentials coming from reliable third-party attestation, or whether I have developed a reputation amongst another trusted group, or in a large enough group that that my opinion and my content has value, and that I am who I say I am, and that my agenda, my point of view is is evident and discoverable. So I'd like to believe that we can deal with a lot of the, kind of, fake stuff out there by using some of these new, blockchain Web3 technologies. And I think that there's a lot of potential, right? I mean, you can put a cryptographic hash on a video and associate it with a videographer or an author of some sort that has, a reputation to protect, and you can ensure that it was, has not been manipulated, that it's not a deep fake and those sorts of things. So I'm hoping that we're going to find a world where we can have more agreement on what truth is by virtue of having greater confidence in what the source of information is, right?
Yeah.
The other side of that equation, though, is the whistleblower scenario, right? So there may be situations where you want to have some form of anonymity that says, I want to, blow the whistle because my company is doing something irresponsible or immoral, or I'm a person in government and I want to, I need to blow the whistle on whatever. And I'm sure there's lots of other scenarios like that. But that I want to be able to, I want people to have confidence that I am in a position to have knowledge about and be, I'm not just crying wolf and I'm just not an outsider, but I have access to the information that I am arguing, should be out there. But I don't want to expose who I technically am, right? I want to be able to say, I am a U.S. senator, but not that I am this U.S. senator, right? Or, pick some other example. So how do we deal with that issue that there is nuance about what parts of identity we are going to want to be able to surface in different situations?
Yeah. So that's a really, it's not complicated, but it's complex in the sense that there are lots of different things that play into all of this. So I would go back to this idea that we build identity systems to create relationships, and relationships are all about context, right? So you just talked about a couple of different kinds of contexts. One where you want to prove that you are, say, the host of a particular podcast. And other people want to rely on that proof because they know about you and they know about the podcast series, and
sure.
Now that and it has some reputational value. Different kind of context, the whistleblower context, where we don't necessarily need to know the who's, we need to know the what's. We need to know the what of, you mentioned senator, but it could be that you worked for the Department of Commerce or that you were
NSA, pick something.
Yeah, whatever, right? So the what's of it. And, too often when people think about digital identity, they focus on the who's rather than the what's. So because most relationships really care more about the what's than they care about the who's. And if you just ask people, gee, how do we solve the problem of digital identity? The first thing people kind of think about is, oh, well, we need like an identity, right? People think about, but we need like a national identifier that's digital that everybody can, use. And now I know exactly that I'm talking to a particular person. But, nothing in life is universal, right? You don't have a single identity that you project to everyone. You've got different identities for every relationship that you have. And so a digital identity system really needs to be able to service the context of any given relationship. So in the case of the whistleblower, right, what you want is you want some kind of pseudonymity, not anonymity, because, there will be some kind of identifier involved. And you want to be able to prove things about yourself using perhaps some sort of zero knowledge proof inspired, minimally disclosing interaction, right? You use credentials to prove that, yes, I worked for the U.S. government between these years without proving anything else about yourself, right? That your name or where you live or anything else. So we have to bring different kinds of technologies and different ways of interacting to different relationships depending on the context. There's no single universal solution. But there is a way to create an underlying platform, which, Kim Cameron, who a Canadian who recently died, unfortunately, but he called this the identity meta system. Right? It's not an identity system; it's a meta system. That is a system for building systems. And so, the most famous example of a meta system is probably the internet. The internet is not a communications platform. It's a platform for building communications platforms. And so we have lots of different ways that we use the internet to communicate, but there's no single way that you communicate on the internet. Same thing would be true of an identity meta system, right? It is not an identity system. It's a way of building identity systems. And by using that, we now have lots of different ways of using identity in different contexts.
So that's an interesting idea. And as you were talking about that, I was thinking about the healthcare medical record problem, right? I mean, right now we spend just godly amounts of money on the healthcare system. Yeah. And a large part of that is that data is significantly siloized, right? That various different specialists and GPs and doctors and testing facilities, they all have different points of view, and none of them may have a kind of a longitudinal, over time sort of cradle to grave sort of view to provide, a broader context for a particular, test results or diagnosis or whatever. And, I've always believed that if we found a way to have, an ID that follows me for my entire life, that explains who I am, that has all of my test records and all of my doctor's records, so that someone at some point in time that needed that broader context could make a much more precise, diagnosis and come up with a better therapeutic or whatever. And of course, as we get into genomic testing and stuff, this takes on a whole other dimension, right? Because that becomes part of that corpus as well. But, I could build the corpus that has all of that data in it, but I may want to only expose certain parts of that, certain configurations, certain bits and pieces, certain patterns to various different, people in different situations, right? So I might want to expose only a certain portion to my insurance company or to a surgeon that really doesn't need to know about, all these other things that I have going on. They only should care about this piece of it. So finding a way to have all the data there if it's needed to be able to run, who knows, artificial intelligence to find patterns in that data so that I get better outcomes, fine, that's great. But then to only situationally expose subsections of that data to the right people in the right situations when they need it, right? Is that kind of what you're getting at, this idea?
Yeah, so there's at least three different things that you just touched on. One goes back to this idea of substance theory. Right? Are you a bundle of attributes, or is there something tying them together underneath? Right? So you having a record that you control means that you need to somehow be digitally embodied. That's the term I use. I don't know if it's the best term, but it's the best one I've found. Right? Okay. So right now you are not digitally embodied. You exist within other companies' systems by their grace. Right? You do not exist in the internet, except to the extent that Twitter and Google and other places are willing to give you an account.
Yeah, they own the state, right? The remembrance of things, the record of things.
So until we solve that problem, right, of giving you a place to have all of this data that you can interact with others as peers, the problem is now, okay, we have to imagine. A traditional solution to the problem you just posed would be imagining someone who would hold this record on your behalf, right? And so we've got some centralized place that has everybody's medical information. Who's that going to be? Why do we trust them? It's a treasure trove of data for hackers. And so we've never, ever come up with something, right? So we have lots of centralized solutions for things that don't matter that much. We don't have great solutions for things that matter, like health records. So we need some kind of digital embodiment to avoid a centralization of health records problem. Okay? So the second thing that you talked about is you being able to share it. Now, obviously, you can tell anybody anything you want about your health records, but usually if a doctor is going to do surgery and they need health records from somewhere else, they would probably ask for those health records, right? And you'd have to approve that. And
or just redo the test.
They would get them from the source, right? So they would know they are authentic. It's not just, and of course, because you could have made a mistake, you could have misremembered something. All of this. So we need you to be digitally embodied. We need you to be able to share information in a way that's authentic, that others can trust. And the third problem you touched on is you want to share only part of it. Right. So, and you want to share some parts with some people and some parts with other people and decide based on what they need and what the context is, whether you're going to allow that sharing or not. So those are, at least three of the requirements of a system that you just described. And that is essentially a good working definition of self-sovereign identity.
Right.
And
it's where you have sovereignty over that and the ability to decide who gets to see what in what situations.
Yeah. And a good way to think about about sovereignty is not total and complete control, right? Because you're not the dictator. You're just one of many interacting peers, right? So you get autonomy over things that you're going to share, but other people get autonomy over whether they're going to accept them or trust them or tell other people about them, right? So everybody gets to make their own decisions, right? So it's a system of autonomy and independence that really mirrors how the physical world works. You certainly, in the physical world, there's not some overarching administrative authority that you have to log into before you can have a conversation with your friends or go down and buy a Coke from the local convenience store, right? You act as an autonomous being. You are embodied. You can show people credentials about things if they need very authentic data. You can only show them the information that you want. So all we're really trying to do online when we talk about self-sovereign identity is build a system that deals with identity information similar to how identity information and interactions happen in the physical world.
So this is such a fascinating topic, and it touches upon, what I like to think of as a kind of a Faustian bargain that we've made with various different platform companies. We have either by virtue of our active participation, because we write content or we author YouTube videos or whatever, and people view them and advertisers, support them, and the platform, leverages the content that we provide and generates revenue because of it. Or passive, right? We're interacting with an online retail store, and because we buy certain things and other certain things, the patterns of our behaviors are captured, and then that pattern is monetized as a value proposition to other people, which is completely, fully reasonable. But there are a number of these major platform companies that have become $1 trillion plus companies over the last 20 years that, the key of their ability to generate that revenue and create that value is the fact that they own the state around our identity and the interactions we have and the content that we produce. And that begs two questions that in a self-sovereign identity world where the individual now has sovereignty, or the organization has sovereignty over, their data instead of the platform. Number one, does it mean that we should be able to participate in any value creation and monetization of, attributes of our identity, including our reputation or the content we create or the patterns we generate? And the second question is, if that's true, and if we start capturing part of that value, what happens to the business models of a lot of these big platform companies and the services, very many of them very, very valuable, that they provide to us in exchange for the data that we've been giving them for all these years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one of the things you're touching on is what Shoshana Zuboff calls the surveillance economy. She wrote a book, Surveillance Economy. Is a great book. I don't necessarily agree with everything in it, but she is a wonderful writer and, does a great job of explaining how all of this works and why it's ultimately harmful. Now, like you said, I mean, the systems we use are not, I mean, we get a lot of value out of them, right? I like to think of it, though, as being in an amusement park, right? Amusement parks are great, and we all like to visit them from time to time. Well, most of us do. But you wouldn't want to live your entire life inside an amusement park, right? Where every experience is curated, and you are essentially there in order to provide it's essentially a transactional relationship, even if you're there having fun. Real life is not completely transactional, and it's certainly not a curated experience, right? It's one where we function autonomously and occasionally pop in for curated experiences, but don't function entirely within those. And I don't necessarily agree. I mean, I'm very skeptical of the idea of monetizing our personal information. I think, first of all, there are lots of privacy concerns, right? When we ask, what will people be willing to give up for how much money? I also don't think there's really all that much money on an individual basis. That it's probably not going to raise anyone out of poverty, for example, or provide any kind of, universal basic income kind of thing. It's more like, okay, it's going to, provide you with, a few dollars a month kind of thing. So I'm not sure that, monetizing our personal information is a solution to this problem. And I think it's a tough problem, right? Because we get a lot of good services essentially for free because companies are monetizing our data. I happen to believe that ultimately it's harmful to us and it's harmful to society. I don't know how we convince people to start paying for those services. I mean, that's what we would do in the physical world, right? I mean, people don't usually offer you free stuff in the physical world in exchange for, watching what you do, right? It's not, it just, although, I mean, we could go down a rabbit hole of places where people have tried that. But so I don't know what the solution is, right? But I do think that, and I don't view self-sovereign identity as necessarily a way to stick it to, all these big tech companies. I mean, I don't think it's that. I think it's really about new opportunities, right? You mentioned health records. No one company is going to solve the health record problem. It really has to be some kind of meta system solution that looks like the internet, right? With standards and protocols. And that is, that's so far away from saying, what's going to happen with Google if we all go to self-sovereign identity? I mean, probably nothing's going to happen to Google. It'll probably continue offering curated experiences, and we'll probably continue to participate in them. And, slowly over time, society will decide what it wants to do there. So I think there's a lot of opportunities where self-sovereign identity solves problems that just have no solution. Another one of my favorite examples is automobile accidents. Right now, dealing with an automobile accident is a decidedly non-digital experience, right? Not just because we're talking about physical objects, but all of the credentials that you have, right? Your driver's license, the citation you might get, the accident report, your proof of insurance, all of these things even if you might have some digital representation of them, there's no system that ties them all together. And imagining someone building a system for dealing with all of the credentialing issues surrounding an automobile accident, and then getting everybody, all of these various parties to buy into it, it's just almost impossible to imagine. There's just, and that's just one example of an ad hoc identity-based interaction, right? Where there are ephemeral relationships, long-term relationships, lots of authenticated data that has to transfer back and forth. Auto accident is just one, but it's a good example of that. No one's going to build a platform for auto accidents. So how do we bring that experience into the digital world and gain all of the convenience of the digital world when we're dealing with the unfortunate aftermath of an auto accident? The only way we can do that is with standards, protocols, interoperable, systems. Basically, we're talking about the same kind of system as the internet. And so that brings us back to this idea of an identity meta system, right? By building an identity meta system that understands how to create relationships in a self-sovereign or autonomous way, understands how to transfer authenticated data in a privacy-preserving way and in a way that allows you to minimize the data that gets shared to just that which is necessary. Once you've got that kind of system in place, now all kinds of things are possible, whether it's health records, whether it's auto accidents, that really have nothing to do with how do I use Twitter. I mean, might somebody use that system to build a new social media platform? Maybe. I hope they do. But that's not really what it's about, right? It's about things that are, I think, much more fundamental and important to our digital future. Zuboff in her book asks the question, I'm going to get it wrong. It's not an exact quote, but she asks, do we have a home in the digital future, right? Can the digital world be our home in the future? And I think that question largely comes down to, how do we solve the question of digital identity? Are we going to be autonomous, embodied digital entities that can interact as peers with each other, with organizations? Or are we just going to exist by the grace of big companies within their administrative identity systems? And that question really, I think, is the fundamental one that we're trying to answer. Well,
that seems to be an incredibly core question of the whole, what is Web3 all about, and what will the Web3 era usher in? Which kind of brings me to, my final question. I guess I could have mentioned off the top of the podcast that along with your many other accomplishments, you were the author of the Blockchain Research Institute's paper that we published earlier this year on self-sovereign identity, the architecture of personal autonomy and generativity on the internet. And first of all, in it, you explore a lot of these topics in a lot more depth, and it's a great paper, and I encourage everyone to go to blockchainresearchinstitute.org and look in the research library and take a look at this paper. It's got some really great content in it. But in the title, you've got the word generativity, and I know where the word came from, but I'm kind of curious to ask you. You put that in the title of this paper, and it has this kind of broader intergenerational, societal sort of connotation to it, and maybe that's a good place to end this conversation, to kind of explore what you mean by that, and why you think this is so important.
Yeah, so I took the idea of that from a paper by Jonathan Zittrain, who was talking about the generative capacity of the internet, right? And the generativity is a technology's capacity to produce unprompted change, right? Not change that the builders of the technology assumed it was going to make, but stuff that just people thought up afterwards and no one could have anticipated coming, right? And if you think about the internet, the people who were building the internet back in the 80s, I don't know that they had any notions of where it might have gone. I mean, I remember back in the 90s, reading, papers about what is the internet? Oh, it's 300 TV channels. It's just no one could quite grasp what this was. But because the internet was a meta system that allowed other people to build things on top of it, right? That prompted this change that almost anyone can come. Doc Searls and Dave Weinberger, talk about it as nobody owns it, everybody can use it, anybody can improve it, kind of thing, right? And I think that properly done, digital identity has that same thing, right? I mean, the ideas we were just talking about of, solving an auto accident, credentialing problem, or solving health records. I mean, these are big ideas, but there's little ideas too that people will use an identity meta system to solve. And we don't know all of the ways they're going to use it or what they're going to do. Zittrain in his paper talked about 4 different things, right? So in order to be generative, a technology has to have capacity for leverage, meaning it makes things not just possible, but even easy. It has to be adaptable, meaning it's flexible and can be used in lots of different ways, right?
Composable. Has to be highly composable.
A counterexample is an airplane, right? An airplane's not adaptable. An airplane's really useful for flying, right? But people don't go, oh, we've got airplanes. Now I can use them to, produce fantasy novels. I mean, it's just, you wouldn't even imagine that, right? Ease of mastery is another one that he talks about, right? It has to be easy for people to use, right? And certainly the internet, there are people who say, oh, the internet's just way too hard, but the uptake, right? Billions of people using it now just proves that, it's pretty easy to use for various things. And then the last thing was accessibility, right? It has to be available to people. They have to be able to get their hands on it and use it for something. And so, I like to think about this identity, right, in terms of those same kinds of things, right? So, traditional identity systems, right, like almost any identity system you use on almost any platform online, right? I call them administrative because they're built to administer a specific relationship for a particular company or organization, right? They're not general use. They're not general purpose. I can't use my Google login to prove that I'm, over 21 when I go into the bar, right? I mean, it's not what it was built for. So the point there is not that Google couldn't do that, right? They certainly could build that into their platform, but I can't do it. I can't take Google's platform and use it to do that, right? So that means that it can't be leveraged by everybody. It can only be leveraged by the people who built it and own it. So an identity meta system, right, credential exchange in particular, has great leverage. I mean, we just talked about a couple of examples, right? Healthcare and auto accidents. And I don't have to think all of those up ahead of time in order for it to be useful or interesting. Credential exchange, again, right, do verifiable credentials is very adaptable, right? Because almost everything online involves some bundle of data being transmitted, and we often want to know if it's authentic. Almost every workflow involves that use case. So imagine all the possible use cases that there might be, and that technology can be adapted to them. Ease of use.
Yeah, no, I'm totally there with you. I think that one of the amazing things about the potential of the Web3 era is its radical composability. It's decentralized governance. Yeah. It's the primitives, the building blocks upon which we're going to build systems that we haven't even thought of. We haven't got names for that, in 10 years looking back are going to look incredibly obvious. But that's kind of the magic of it, that it provides an opportunity to address very discrete niches in any economic system and to innovate at very accelerated paces, because you just have these building blocks that you can use to put things together.
Yeah, and so that's really the point of generativity, right? Is that generative identity uses these building blocks. I mean, in my case, I happen to believe that verifiable credentials and decentralized identifiers are those building blocks. But those things can be just combined in so many ways by different people to solve their own problems that it's just going to generate more and more solutions to different problems that we can't even imagine at this point.
Well, this is such a fascinating topic, and I know we could talk on for hours and hours and hours on this topic.
Oh, I could just read you my book. I mean, that'd probably take us, I don't know, 3 or 4 days.
I will look forward to its publication. I'll get on the early reservation list on Amazon, and we'll wait for it eagerly. But Phil, thank you so much for joining us. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I'm sure that many of our listeners and viewers have also enjoyed it. Hopefully they will avail themselves of your paper at blockchainresearchinstitute.org. And thank all of you for joining us for this episode of W3B Talks. You can find research on this topic and other topics at blockchainresearchinstitute.org. I'm your host, Doug Heintzman. We hope that you'll join us for our next episode of W3B Talks.